privilege to have the opportunity to learn from him. That's okay, you can talk. And we are joined tonight by my friend Joseph Palazzolo. He'll be playing the piano for us, accompanying us tonight. Joseph? Well, people are going to move it around, so get your loops going, and everybody hopefully will hear just fine. Ezra will be back next week. No, he will not be back next week, because no one will be here next week, because Passover. So those of you who come on Saturday night for the second Seder, he'll be there for that, of course. And that is my first announcement. Next Saturday night is our first community Seder together in 3 years. And I can't tell you, unless something really bizarre happens, I'm very tired of 2 years in a row of talking to a camera. The worst holiday of all was Passover, just being by ourselves. And good company, but it was just the two of us all the time. So I'm so glad we'll be together. If you have not made your reservation, Anne-Marie asks that you please do it by Monday afternoon at the very latest. There's still room. So there's no Friday night service, of course. The following week, I'll be away, but Melanie Goldberg will be leading services for me in my stead. She'll be joined by Ezra. And our speaker will be Joanne Crystal, who works with the Jewish chaplaincy services. And we'll talk about some of the programs they do for the seniors at the various senior centers and homes that we have in our community. And then on the 29th, we will hear from Emily Duthin, who is with the Holocaust Memorial Center. And she will speak about a book and the book she's putting together of her mother's memories. Her mother just died recently, I think just in the past year. She's a Holocaust survivor. So we'll have our annual Yom HaShoah Holocaust service, and she'll join us. And then the month of May, I will not see you, but Melanie will be here. I'm going away, and then going away again, and staying away, and and hopefully the United States will let me come back. Because for some reason I still haven't gotten COVID. I don't understand it. I seem to be the last person in America. And by the way, I was tested today, so I still don't have it. Anyway, we'll start now. Arthur with the first slide. I think we've got this thing jury-rigged to work this week, and we're getting it fixed permanently on Tuesday. Where the world is dark with illness, let us kindle the light of healing. Where the world is bleak with suffering, let us kindle the light of caring. Where the world is dimmed by lies, let us kindle the light of truth. May honor of lighting this flame fire us to acts of goodness that illumine all the world. In the mitzvah of kindling these Shabbat candles, remind us to sanctify life with the power of light. I'd like to ask Tom and Lonnie to please come light our Shabbat candles. Sandy Altman, Susie Friedman, Rabbi Miriam Jairus, and Karen Lutz, with whom we'll begin with our next reading. Karen. Oh, there you are.
Hello, can you hear me? Wonderful. Okay. Tonight, as we welcome Shabbat, we look to this moment in time.
No.
That's what I thought.
I don't know
I
what
thought I was
happened here.
5, yes.
Okay.
Aye.
You'll go sit down, and I'll do this one. And we had a little number mix-up. It happens. Everybody knows I'm not good at math, but I can count. Our ancestors hallowed the Sabbath day. In dark times, it was a refuge for them. And in times of prosperity, it gave them rest and joy. As a community, we celebrate the opportunity to gather in that spirit, even as we imagine Shabbat anew. May we, too, find rest from the day's work and refuge from our cares. May we, too, feel the warmth of love and companionship. May we, too, feel our joys heightened and our sorrows softened by the love we give and receive. May we be blessed with Shabbat joy. May we be blessed with Shabbat peace. May we be blessed with Shabbat light. Shalom Aleichem, Ohavei Shalom, Shomrei Shalom. Shalom Aleichem, Rodefei Shalom, Shalom Aleichem. Bochem LeShalom, Ohavei Shalom, Zeichem LeShalom. Miyom Zelayamim Abayim, Shalom Aleichem. Shalom Aleichem, Ohavei Shalom, Shomrei Shalom. Shalom Aleichem, Rodefei Shalom, Shalom Aleichem. Bochem LeShalom, Ohavei Shalom, Zeichem LeShalom. Miyom Zelayamim Abayim, Shalom Aleichem.
Tonight, as we welcome Shabbat, we look to this moment in time to once again gain perspective on where we have been and where we are going. On this Shabbat, may we find the space to consider and to challenge. May we find the courage to do what is right. Together, let us find meaning, calm our anxieties, understand our purpose, and appreciate our accomplishments. Let us find the strength to continue working for ourselves and others. Let us share the burdens and blessings of responsibility. Let us locate the will to change the things we can no longer accept. Let us do all of this and more, mindful that we are a community of humanistic Jewish believers, unbroken and unbowed, prepared to face all that life has in store for us. Let us strive to feel these bonds of belief and community when we are together and when we are apart. Let us rejoice in our ties. Let us rejoice in our collective power. Let us rejoice in the gift of Shabbat.
Besami mulevona, lerad leif mita. Laila yored le'ah, ruach shoshan roshva. Abel chash lashir balad, zemer shel
Hello. Shabbat Shalom lekulam. It's funny, yesterday was my wife's father's birthday. Today is my father's anniversary, 37 years. He's buried about 100 years from the Ukraine border, so it's double. Anyhow, at one with our forebears, we affirm that righteousness and enlightenment shall be our torch. We shall teach these values diligently to our children all the days of our lives. We shall endeavor to live by these values in the comfort of our homes or on the cold and windswept roads. Whether adversity bows our heads or fulfillment makes our spirit soar, our hands shall meet our justice to all, and our eyes shall be open to the light of the truth. We shall emblazon our paths through life with this light as a beacon for our humankind. Thank you.
Neil deGrasse Tyson wrote, "We are all connected to each other biologically, to the earth chemically, to the rest of the universe atomically. There's as many atoms in a single molecule of your DNA as there are stars in the typical galaxy. We are, each of us, a little universe." Carl Sagan put it this way, "The cosmos is within us. We are made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself."
the transforming power of love, the redeeming power of compassion, the healing power of forgiveness. These endure in every age. The joy which comes from sharing, and the strength which comes from striving, the nourishment which comes from nature, these endure in every age. The sanctity of life, the value of truth, the primacy of justice, these endure in every age. Amidst never-ending change, may we have the wisdom to know and to cherish those teachings which endure for all time.
Don't merely expect to find or to believe that life is worthwhile. Make it worthwhile. Don't merely see life whole, make it whole. Not knowing which should come first, to improve oneself or to improve the world. We end up doing neither. Actually, the only way to improve the world is by improving oneself, and the only way to improve oneself is by improving the world.
In this community where we find strength and common purpose, we turn our minds and hearts toward all those who need our love and support, those who are ill, those who suffer pain of the body or spirit, those who are lonely, those who have been wronged. Tonight, we extend our well wishes to these members of our community and to their loved ones, to Joe Gaydon, to Rabbi Peter Schweitzer. We think, too, of those suffering in Ukraine and in other parts of the world under the threat of guns and bombing and warfare. And we think of those among us and our friends as we go around the room, starting on this side. Anybody here? Melanie? Miriam? Anybody else over here? On this side, anybody? Go ahead, yes. Did we miss anyone? May all who heal know that they are not alone. May they be healed quickly. May they experience a refuah shlema, a complete recovery, the renewal of their bodies, and the renewal of their spirits. And let us say, Shalom.
In the words of my dear friend, Arthur Lee Paber, I lost your voice. I lost your timbre, your cadence, your accent. I lost your voice. I had it the first month. I had it the first year. Then it faded. Then it was gone. I lost your voice. I can't hear it anymore. I lost your voice, but not your words. Your words of approval, your words of wisdom, your words of support, of love, of guidance. I lost your voice, but I'll always have your words. She's crying.
Our thoughts turn to those who are no longer with us, our own loved ones, those whom our friends and neighbors have lost, the martyrs of our people whose graves are unmarked, and those of every people and nation whose lives have been a blessing to humanity. As we remember them, we meditate on the meaning of love and loss, of life and death. We recall now our loved ones whom death has recently taken from us, those who died at this season in years past, and those whom we have taken into our hearts with our own. Tonight we observe the yahrzeits of Lawrence Altman, Robert Berman, Rose Bricker, Rosalie Bieber Brown, Max Bruck, Barry S. Donner, Max Hirsch, Arnold Kirstein, Shirley Klein, Milton Luria, Richard S. Lutz, Irene Ozer, Lydia Bandy Karnes-Slachter, and Andre Zadur. If there's someone whom you're thinking about tonight, whose name you'd like to share, Melanie? Lonnie? Anybody that we missed? Yes, Sandy. And I'd like to remember those who have died in both the terrorist incidents this week and last in Israel, and everybody on every side of that conflict who has died as an innocent person. Yehi zichram livracha. May the memories of these beloved people provide us with a sense of comfort as we go through our lives in their absence. So thank you again. We'll hear from Joseph one more time at the end with our closing song. But now we have the wonderful privilege. Oh, I forgot the Kaddish. No, it's only my 10th year doing, my 9th year doing this. And there was a pandemic. And now we're going to say, and you know, has anybody noticed that we changed this Kaddish? I want to point out something. We changed a couple things in this, and as long as I made my flub, I'll take a moment to point it out. Somebody said to me a few years ago, why are we talking about raising ourselves up? And I think that we want to raise ourselves up, but the language was a little bit awkward. Let us sanctify and glorify ourselves, it said. And I don't know, sometimes I don't feel so much like humanity is in need too much of more sanctifying of itself and glorifying of itself. So I thought about some different words. And so I invite you now to stand as we recite together our humanistic interpretation of Kaddish. Together, Nit Gadal v'Nit Kadash beruach ha'adam. Let us dignify and ennoble all people in the spirit of our shared humanity. Let us acclaim the preciousness of life. Let us show gratitude for life by approaching it with reverence. Let us embrace the whole world, even as we wrestle with its parts. Let us each in our own way take up our share in serving the world and seeking truth. May our commitment to life help us to strengthen healing of spirit and peace of mind. May justice and peace permeate and comfort the house of Israel and all those who dwell on earth. And let us say, Ken Yehi, may it be so. Thank you. Please be seated. Okay, that feels more right. You know, sometimes you remember that book, Who Moved My Cheese? Right? That was about like making just a little change. So we have a different piano player tonight. You make a little change and all of a sudden your trajectory just, it's a common psychological phenomenon to which I fell victim. But now, now we will hear from our wonderful guest speaker. I want to take a moment to introduce Ron. I know you all know him, but I think that his accomplishments bear repeating in gratitude, if nothing else, when we meet. He is the Distinguished Professor Emeritus of the History of Ideas, and I know the history of how the history of ideas started, but I still think it's the coolest title any professor could ever have. At Wayne State, of course. He grew up here in Detroit, studied there at Wayne State, also UCLA, at the University of Michigan, at Brandeis University, and that's where he earned his PhD. In his academic work, he has served as visiting lecturer and researcher at Chicago's DePaul University, University College of London, the University of Natal, and other South African universities where he spent some time. He's the recipient of several scholarly and teaching awards and a past president of Wayne State's Academy of Scholars. He has written countless articles for popular and academic journals, including The Nation, the Yale Review, the Chronicle of Higher Education, the Washington Post, the International Herald Tribune of blessed memory, and the Toronto Star, and that's just a tiny taste. Along the way, he found time to produce a number of enormously well-received and important televised debates featuring some of the greatest leaders, activists, and academics of our time. Ron is considered one of the world's foremost authorities on Jean-Paul Sartre. He has written several books about the philosopher and other significant works, such as, and this is probably one of the most important books any humanist can read, Living Without God, New Directions for Atheists, Agnostics, Secularists, and the Undecided, and a book that I just loved called We, Reviving Social Hope. Ron's a tireless activist. He has a long list of contributions to the peace movement, to other social justice causes. Today he works in activism, of course, through his writing with the Huntington Woods Peace, Citizenship, and Education Group project. He's a member of our congregation. He's collaborated on several important events here, and notably he and I have worked on some panel discussions around Israel and Palestine issues, which I think were extraordinarily well received and very important. Tonight he's going to attempt to answer the question, whatever happened to We're All in This Together, which may form the basis of an upcoming book, and we're the first to hear some of these ideas from Ron. Please join me in welcoming Ron Aronson.
Shabbat Shalom. You remember we're all in this together? Everybody remembers it? Because when I mentioned it to Jeff, he said, well, it was a second 2 years ago, and then it vanished. And you remember the feeling when you heard it the first or second time, you said, oh my God, there's something to that. And it shouldn't have vanished. That's the problem. It was seen for a while, and it was heard everywhere. I remember the gas station coming into Birmingham if you went out to Cranbrook to take a walk, and there was a big gas station coming into town, and we're all in this together for really over a year, while it was disappearing everywhere else. It had obviously a public health meaning, but it also proclaimed our deep social and economic dependence on each other, and it unwittingly provoked questions about the inequalities pervading our society. Racial inequalities were challenged more broadly than ever, starting at the end of May 2 years ago, after the police murder of George Floyd, and there was an echo in many of our minds, we're all in this together, well, what about American racism? Tens of millions of Americans of all races and all over the country demonstrated against what by common agreement became described as systemic racism. Remember, we were talking about that too, and it seems also to have disappeared. But Trump's base had already gone in a very different direction. The previous month, going back 2 years now, it's actually 2 years almost this month, April 17th. Do you remember the Liberate Michigan moment? The state capitol was invaded by an armed mob rebelling against Governor Gretchen Whitmer's public health orders. They made it frighteningly clear that a large number of Americans were refusing to face the reality of the pandemic, definitely choosing to not be in it together with the rest of us, and they would refuse to face the issues raised by the George Floyd uprising. Since then, their disconnect and their anger, what's happened to it? Well, if all in it together has vanished, their disconnect and their anger have only grown. That's the striking fact. And by 2022, they show no signs of returning to what the rest of us think is reality. Some of us might try to be charitable by asking whether the battles over mask and vaccine mandates are simply struggles over our reality versus theirs. But it's hard to be charitable when we think of the widespread acceptance of the big lie about the stolen election. Republican-imposed laws stoking the false voting security claims around the country, the hysterical efforts to pass laws forbidding the teaching of critical race theory, whatever that is, and the fact that 1 out of every 4 Republican voters, it's 1 out of every 6 Americans, 1 out of every Republican voters believe the core QAnon assertion that the country's dominated by a conspiracy of satanic pedophiles. This is madness, said Senator Mitt Romney, as Trump was rejecting the 2020 election results and claiming that he actually won a second term. Since then, this is December of 2020, since then, many of us have felt impelled to say the same thing again and again. This is madness. Of course, Romney's use of madness is really a patrician's judgment about what has been going on. You know, Romney didn't like it. It must have been madness. But it's also a statement about the mental state of those who are participating in and supporting it. Even if we use it casually, anybody use that term in the last couple of years? Madness? You ever think this is what's going on is madness? It really, and then we drop it. We don't think seriously about it, right? Because how do you deal with it? Well, it does turn on a basic understanding about reality. Mad actions go massively against reality or are based on systematically distorted perceptions, or worse, they stem from being enclosed in subjectivity to the point of denying decisive aspects of the world out there. Madness entails substituting a made-up or fundamentally distorted fantasy world and then acting upon that. More than making mistakes about what's there, it's about rejecting facts, evidence, and rational argument, and replacing them with an alternate reality. Insofar as people become heavily invested in an alternate reality and belong to a culture where this is widespread, returning to the real world becomes impossible for them. They develop a stake in and social support for radical denial. As we see from the vaccine and mask controversies, denying reality and truth, and it makes appropriate behavior and rational disagreement impossible. That's what's happened to we're all in it together. That's what happened to it. The best term I've been able to come up with to describe today's Trump-encouraged processes, and it's not wholly dissimilar from those that unfolded in Nazi Germany, as I wrote about in a book called The Dialectics of Disaster, is social madness. Although using the term madness runs the constant risk of being confused with our understanding of individual psychology. The term is actually describing a social process, one in which people collectively, and I'll sort of recapitulate some of what I've just said, go well beyond being simply nostalgic or even irrational. Make a decisive rupture with reality. Reject well-established and fundamental societal norms and understandings. Act on demented visions with violent or potentially catastrophic consequences. As I say, they leave no space for arguing rationally with them. And you know this, there have been a lot of discussions. Newspapers, online has been filled with, I tried to talk with Trump supporters, and I gave up. And it's an interesting phenomenon of the past 5 years. How many people actually tried? How many people said we should be doing this? We shouldn't just be dismissing them. We shouldn't be simply rejecting them out of hand. We should try to talk rationally. And then people are presenting their efforts to talk rationally with tremendous pain and tremendous discomfort because it didn't work again and again. Now, madness or insanity, if you want, are the old-fashioned descriptions for what we're seeing. The contemporary clinical term for what I'm talking about, but applied to individuals, is psychosis. National Institutes of Mental Health describes psychosis as, the key of it is, and I'm quoting them, loss of contact with reality. And I'll keep quoting. Symptoms of psychosis include delusions, false beliefs, and hallucinations, seeing or hearing things that others do not see or hear. That's end of quote. There are two aspects of this. One having to do with contemporary social media and how people are increasingly isolating themselves in digital communities that have lost touch with normal processes of validation and verification. People who study, as my daughter does, who study contemporary social media, point out that people increasingly get bound up with social media and lose touch with what's going on outside. But the other piece of this, which I'd like to focus on, is that this process in the world we see around us is intentionally willed against all evidence. My concern isn't to diagnose individuals medically, but rather to describe our current societal disorder by focusing on its quality of delusion and denial. to repeat, the inability or unwillingness of large masses of people to distinguish between reality and fantasy, and their intention to act politically according to this derangement. This is what's been happening among Trump's base, and it is reshaping American politics as the Republican Party, already the party of racism and evangelical Christianity, has been remade according to the denial of science, including climate science, the cult of Trump, the denial of the pandemic, including the refusal of vaccination and wearing masks, and the big lie surrounding the election. Think of it, a supreme leader surrounded by those eager to find their way to power by breaking the system, as historian Timothy Snyder describes them, with followers unwilling or unable to listen to reason and eager to resort to violence. This is a recipe for catastrophe. It was foreshadowed on January 6th, and its development is further advanced today. Rather than being met with shame and regret, it's now accepted and even celebrated. As historian Eli Zaretsky says, in relating Freud's theory of the demagogue to Trump's base, they have replaced reason with loyalty. Embracing Trump as their leader has entailed the act of raising his words, his thoughts, his fantasies over their own normal perceptions and reasoning processes and networks of authority. Tens of millions of Americans have done this. I'm not, to repeat, talking about individuals' mental health. So what am I talking about? Most of their mental health functioning might in fact be actually quite normal. And many of those drafting bills for election integrity are no doubt lawyers, trained professionals who are doing so cynically. What Snyder calls gamers, not at all believing in the big lie, but using it to advance what has become the Republican agenda of minority rule. Instead of chalking this up to individual mental health problems, I'm making a statement about a deranged process in our midst. That's my first point. My second comes from my study of the philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre. It's that groups of people do not lose contact with reality, whatever that means. They break it off intentionally. They become incapable of recognizing it. They make themselves incapable of recognizing it because they made themselves unwilling or unable to do so by collectively organizing themselves around something else. In this case, loyalty to their leader. But why? People have not been choosing that course casually. It's not a mistake, and it's not something that just happens. But they're doing it only under great stress and because they collectively lack the tools to deal with whatever that stress is effectively, or when other paths are blocked. Sartre, again, gives us a sense of the dynamic by describing the less extreme and individual disorder, neurosis, as being chosen by the organism, and I'm quoting Sartre now, in order to be able to live an unlivable situation. What's the unlivable situation in the United States today that millions of people are experiencing, in which Trump's base has found itself? My third point, then, is to ask, what collective stress is it that these millions of people are experiencing? Now, there are various useful explanations of who belongs to Trump's base and what motivates them, beginning with the New York Times discussions the day after the election of the working-class Trump voters, and much further discussion everywhere of Trump supporters in declining areas and declining industries. Connected with this is the endlessly cited lack of college education among Trump supporters. What's the role of, quote unquote, the tyranny of merit discussed by political philosopher Michael Sandel, in which collective sources of dignity, such as labor unions, have faded, and college and university degrees have become the society's highest value and its measuring rod, and from which 2/3 of the population remain excluded? And what about the strength of Trump's support among those living in declining rural areas and old industrial cities? Left Behind, this is the title of a book by sociologist Robert Wuthnow about rural America, is a common descriptor of the 2,000 counties that have become Trump country. 72 of 83 counties in Michigan, you know this? All of them on the downswing voted for Trump in 2020. Most of Michigan, if you look at a map, is red, Trump country. 12 counties, and you can actually, off the top of your head, list what the 12 counties are that voted for Biden. Fewer commentators explaining Trump, and myself included, in the book Jeff referred to, Reviving Social Hope, noticed Trump's rock-solid popularity among white evangelical Christians, who provided nearly half of his votes in both elections. What is it about their common racial, religious outlook that predisposes them to become first Republicans and then Trump's base? The question is, haven't they been affected by seeing, or what is the effect on them, by seeing blacks in high office, especially the presidency, and everywhere in prominent positions in U.S. society? We might celebrate that. They don't. Remember the Tea Party exploded on the scene in 2009 with the watchword? Remember the watchword? This one you will remember. Take our country back. Take our country back. These thoughts are suggesting that much of white America is being collectively traumatized by what many perceive, they do, I don't, as an extreme situation and which offers them no easy answers, and that they have few tools or coping mechanisms for dealing with. I'm talking about the dread of many whites, especially among that political religious category of evangelical Christians, of becoming a racial and religious minority. Already motivating Trump supporters, that fear has since 2020 been sharpened by being defeated in an election by a broad coalition of whites and non-whites, including countless non-Christians. Proof of their trauma that 70% of Trump voters believe in the big lie. Trump said it, they believe it because he said it, but they also are disposed to believe it because it helps make sense in a crazy way of something they fear and feel. It gives a focus to their dread. Now, think about this. After a generation, who are these people? Well, after a generation of listening to apocalyptic, fearful sermons about America going to hell, as the common stock of evangelical Christianity in the United States in the past 40 years, many of Trump's supporters have had considerable training in thinking fearfully and angrily about the changing world. But religious dogmatism, for example, biblical literalism and rejection of evolution and climate science, makes them ill-equipped to deal with what they see around them. They do not have the tools because their background and their culture have been depriving them of developing the tools to make sense of the present. Looking out into the wider world and its default emphasis on science, technology, and secular education, this is the world we all live in. Looking out at that wider world constantly reminds them of their distance from the mainstream and constantly stokes resentment about being disrespected. Notice what I'm saying. They're not necessarily being disrespected by you or me, but above all, by the very terms of the prevailing culture. It's enormous stress on secular knowledge, expertise, gender equality, rationality, and the authority of science. From the beginning, Trump walked into a situation which had been well prepared for him and expertly manipulated the sense of being disrespected as a source of grievance, even if there's no disrespector. It's the culture itself. In an interview on Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network shortly before the election, the 2016 election, Trump explained, I'm going to quote him, "If we don't win this election, you'll never see another Republican." He elaborated, "I think this will be the last election that the Republicans have a chance of winning because you're going to have people flowing across the border. You're going to have illegal immigrants coming in and they're going to be legalized and they're going to be able to vote. And once that all happens, you can forget it." Now, translate that from the dog whistle language. You means white Christian patriarchal America, as understood by evangelical Christians especially. Decline means that their racial, gender, and religious preeminence will be ended as they become a minority, which is happening. You can forget it means that Trump is the white patriarchal Republican Party's last chance to keep power, and that something essential to its people will be lost if they lose power. Something essential to them. Trump's dark warning points to the decline of white evangelical hopes, interesting historical process going on here, after their spectacular rise in the 1970s and 1980s. Some of us remember the religious right, and some of us remember the Christian coalition, and some of us remember during the period of Reagan that putting down of secular America, well, that was during the upsurge of the religious right. And they have kept on upsurging demographically to a point where by the 70s or 80s, they had surpassed, it was sometime in the 1980s, they had surpassed mainstream Christians demographically. And they felt they were in the process of taking over Christianity in America. As the moral majority a generation ago, their numbers increased enormously. It's worth studying why. It has to do, secret, it has to do with their reaction to the 60s. And suddenly, and in part, in other words, they were part of not a religious, yes, a religious response, but which was at root also a cultural and political response to racial integration, to feminism, to the beginnings of gay liberation, and a sense of upheaval and that sense of American change. And a lot of people at that point, if you study the history of evangelical Christianity, found their way there in response to many of us. By 1980, they had become the largest single bloc in the Republican Party. And the problem for them is that the trends they sought to arrest, racial integration, sexualization of the culture, pornography everywhere, then abortion, as I said, women's equality, acceptance of homosexuality, all of these trends have only accelerated. Their worst moment came, Armageddon, in 2015, when gay marriage became the law of the land. More ominous yet, according to the latest survey, is that white evangelical Christians are actually now outnumbered again by mainstream Christians. It's an interesting process. It has to do with the fact that so many of the youth being raised in evangelical Christian families have a sense of the arrogance and the anger of their family's religion and the politicization of it, and they back away from evangelical Christianity. We know that close on to 30% of Americans now call themselves nuns, following no religion. So evangelical Christians are now clearly in relative numerical decline. It also has to do with immigration trends, I say the growth of the nuns. And the problem for so many Americans is being evangelical is now generally seen as political, as much of a political identity as a religious identity. It's an interesting fact that the Trump vote among a large share of Americans went up. We know that. from 2016 to 2020, and a lot of people who are not necessarily religious accepted calling themselves evangelical and being Trump supporters at the same time, whatever religious belief they had. A narrow-minded and dogmatic religious belief, according to many of their children. So its power to reproduce itself among its young has really diminished. So just as Trump has gained many new adherents among them, his base has expanded, and they feel no less outnumbered. They feel no less a sense of dread about the changes in America around them. So, interesting sociological fact, survey fact, by the 2016 election, a large majority of them voiced the impression that things had changed for the worse since the 1950s. A sizable majority of white evangelical Christians even claiming to perceive as much discrimination be directed at them as at blacks and other minorities. You know, this is interesting. That's an example of seeing something that isn't there, literally. In the book Strangers in Their Own Land, sociologist Arlie Russell Hochschild tellingly presents white Southerners' feelings of being overlooked and insulted after playing by the rules, but being passed over by government attention to blacks, women, refugees, and other immigrants. So by 2015, imagine the situation: a wealthy, flashy star of The Apprentice, who had earlier found his racial political niche by calling for the death penalty for the Central Park Five, who were falsely accused, and stoking the birther hoax, his big life accomplishment up until that point, became a champion of male sexual prowess and militant whiteness at the same time, and a champion of the racial and cultural fear of his people became built into Trumpism. You know the facts, I'm sure. The church leaders, evangelical church leaders, embraced Trump, and 81% of those calling themselves white evangelicals voted for him in 2016, and roughly the same number in 2020. So they form core of his base. So we've lived through the drama of denial on the part of Trump and his acolytes that's been playing out during the pandemic. To get back to the pandemic, made his base a powerful negative constituency, crippling its ability to cope effectively with public health issues, which they cannot handle, and further fueling their own alienation from the mainstream. And you've seen some of them shouting at little kids wearing masks going to school. And that's not about the kids. It's probably not even about the pandemic. It's about their sense of alienation. This drives Trumpism. Although enormous numbers of other whites, and for a moment as America as a whole, in May and June of 2020, during the George Floyd uprising, although many of us were coming to a new reckoning with our national racist past during the George Floyd uprising, this public shift was met by incomprehension by Trump's base. What do you mean, Black Lives Matter? Don't all lives matter? What do you mean, racism? How can you teach about racism in public schools? Isn't that a racist agenda? Egged on by Trump, over 80% of Republicans, now a clear majority in nearly every red state, oppose the slogan, Black Lives Matter. That's not just an innocent slogan. It's a hot bone of contention. And if you're curious about that, in a couple of weeks, when the Huntington Woods Peace Group starts standing on the corner at Woodward and 11 Mile Road, carrying signs like Black Lives Matter, note the conversation from passing motorists who shout, all lives matter. They're not the majority. They're a small minority, as a matter of fact. But it's striking to hear people not get it. To return to the question, why are Trump's base ill-equipped to face the present? Journalists and college-educated public seem fixated on the misleading and inappropriate question of who has or doesn't have a four-year degree. In the meritocracy of the New York Times, it seems that this is their default explanation for everything bad. We forget that this increasingly emboldened crowd have a deep history. They are largely heirs of an earlier American history, already filled with waves of resistance, defeat, resentment, and defiance accumulated over generations. They're the descendants of those who defended racial segregation, supported the campaigns of Barry Goldwater and George Wallace, belonged to the anti-busing movement, were for the Vietnam War and against the peace movement of the 60s, defended school prayer in the 70s, opposed the Equal Rights Amendment, embraced the moral majority and the Christian coalition. Today, of course, they oppose gay marriage, give endless support for the gun culture under the theme of gun rights, and believe in, quote unquote, religious freedom to refuse to bake wedding cakes for gay couples. And many of them still justify police killings of unarmed black men. When a black president was elected, their representatives in Washington vowed to block him at every turn and make him a one-term president. It's Mitch McConnell. They joined the Tea Party under the dog whistle slogan of "Take our country back," as I've said. Indeed, because open religious hostility has become a no-no, because open hostility has become a no-no, we've really become a dog whistle country. Just walk around and think of how many political statements are really dog whistle statements of very deep racial and other kinds of animus. Encouraged by none other than Trump, the birthers doubted that Obama was born in this country, accused him of being a Muslim. Now, there is this deep history in the United States, and Trump's presidency, his candidacy in 2015 already, absorbed the bitter edge of our racist history and brought it into the present against Muslims, of course against women, against Mexican and Central American immigrants, against black foreign countries and black majority American cities. Trump's base also belong, go back in time a little further, to a deeper story that reaches well into the heritage of slavery and that has given them a major part of their identity, their white Christian identity. How the roots of today's evangelical Christianity can be traced, if you want to do the work, to the slaveholding South, and how after the Civil War, the defeated South restored white rule and overthrew Reconstruction, how its redeemers kept the freed slaves at bay through Jim Crow and terror, including lynching, keeping them as near as possible to their former condition, how achieving this entailed systematic retardation of the South, keeping it as an isolated, impoverished backwater, lacking industrialization, cities, education, and immigrants. The South before the Civil Rights Movement. How the white South came to embrace the kinds of anti-modernist religion that fit its self-chosen backwardness. The South, I'm saying, chose backwardness for a better part of a century. Why? In order to keep blacks oppressed. Then, its evangelical Christianity spread north and west with millions of white migrants, especially around the time of World War II. And as they got jobs in factories up north here and in the west. And as unions were being defeated in the southern states, these migrants and their churches southernized much of American society between the end of World War II and the 1970s. How their religions embraced anti-communism and foolishly sold themselves to unregulated capitalism during this time, and how new millions joined the faithful of this religious tradition in the process of coming to oppose the transformations brought about by the Civil Rights Movement, the women's movement, the anti-war and youth rebellions of the 60s, and so on. This story reflects back to us how the bitter resistance to modernity equality, and democracy has spilled over from its starting point, slavery, to poison the rest of American life, and how significant our own agenda of secular humanism is in the coming battle to overcome the death grip of the past and bring America to its senses. Question is, am I going overboard in my critical language? And does this only add to the polarization of America's cultural politics? After all, according to the researchers of an important new project called Cultural Cognition, people get their cues about what to consider true or false, not from their years in college, but from the communities and digital bubbles in which they're embedded. For example, and this is quoting from this project, if a person forms the wrong position in his group or her group on climate change relative to the one that people with whom she has a close affinity and on whose high regard and support she depends in myriad ways in her daily life, she could suffer extremely unpleasant consequences, from shunning to the loss of employment. So her individual acceptance of cultural irrationality is in itself rational in her world. In other words, because the cost of being out of sync with her peers is potentially catastrophic, she might use all her intelligence, including all of her college education, to be able to argue against what seemed to us to be normal, rational perception in order to conform to others in her cultural group. So the point of this Cultural Cognition project is to give equal respect to opposing positions in today's cultural wars in order to find a way from one to the other, rejecting the notion that reasoning and education are the keys to finding common ground, and wanting to use research to find ways to connect people. But, what if the other culture has gone off the rails in a decisive respect? For example, denying the pandemic, or ignoring time-tested public health conclusions, or embracing the big lie about the 2020 election. Yes, their culture might be demanding that its members accept these lies, but they're lies. Wholesale distortions of reality, fundamental and potentially catastrophic acts of denial. The premises of that outlook might indeed be becoming so irrational as to cause a danger to a democratic society, to all of us, to the planet itself. The premises of that cultural project urgently demand to be understood and fought against. Research and respect may be helpful in doing this, but in the end, we're talking about a political project and, to conclude, the necessity of doing battle against it. Thank you. Sure.
You scared the hell out of me. Good. And thank you for doing that.
Thank you for.
You know, so what do we do?
Yeah.
This is like Nazi Germany.
That's like Nazi Germany. That's what. Yes.
37,
That's right.
1936, 37,
Yes.
38,
Yes.
39.
Yes.
The masses of people that loved Hitler.
Yeah. To me, it's that serious.
Yeah.
It's that serious, and this is about Trumpism after Trump, if you think about it, because this craziness has been unleashed by Trump, but face facts, a lot of it was there before him, and it's continuing as he is, which I think he is fading out of the picture. And the big lie is, an example of it.
The newscasts like Fox News
Yeah.
and they're starkly different. And
Different realities.
that, of course, didn't occur in Nazi Germany because there was no CNN and no Fox News. And it's amazing how different they are and what they believe. Yeah,
Yeah, that's one way to put it. That's a generous way to put it. No, seriously, I want to say, it's starkly different beliefs, but add starkly different perceptions of reality, starkly different realities they live in. Right. Yeah. It's not rational. No.
Saul, go ahead, we'll take just one, because the hour's getting late.
Did I? Oh.
Go ahead.
Of? Right.
I think he said that.
But I said that.
He said that.
I respectfully submit okay, yes, thank you.
He said, but Saul, he said that. This is not psychosis.
Like when people talk about Zionism, they say, oh, it's not anti-Jewish. Of course it is. And I find it hurtful, and I find it not necessary.
Well,
Repeat the question.
okay. From his professional perspective as a board-certified psychiatrist, he's disagreeing with my use of mental illness terms. So let me explain. I am not talking about individual mental health. I make no claim to understand it, and I make no claim that Trump's supporters... Wait, let me finish. No, let me finish. I make no claim to say that his supporters are suffering from mental health problems. I am talking about this from a social point of view. And I'm saying, as one can in studying Nazi Germany, from a social point of view, you can talk about a process of social madness. I've written about that in terms of Nazi Germany in the book I mentioned. I'm not saying they are. I'm talking about a social process. And now, how do you characterize a social process? You characterize a social process by what it means, not for individual mental health, but what it happens when a culture or a society becomes, or a group becomes encapsulated in a unreal, in a denial, in a, what else can we call it? In a system in which they are creating an artificial fantasy reality, and everyone belonging to that group, in order to belong to that group, shares in that false reality and refuses to look beyond that reality to test it in any normal process. I don't know what that means for mental health. I don't care about what it means for mental health. What I care about is what it means for group social functioning. And when you can take a population, Jews, for example, or in the United States, take a process like the 2020 election and lie about what it means, totally distort it, and then act according to that distortion, and in a way that has horrible consequences, catastrophic consequences, and in which people cannot break out of that false view, whether it would be through therapy or through logic. No, they're encapsulated in a social, cultural process. And that's what happened in Nazi Germany. I don't know what's happening with that in terms of Ukraine. I don't think so. But I think that's what's happening in the United States today.
One question more, Sandy, and then we need to...
Something happened in Michigan today that I think may fit very well into your thesis, and that was the verdict in the governor's,
Oh, gosh. Yeah.
Were they acquitted?
They were acquitted.
They were acquitted.
Except there was a mistrial. Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's great.
I haven't followed it closely enough to understand whether these guys were serious or were just talking off the top of their heads. They were carrying out a process, and the two most serious ones are going to be retried. So it's not, so the, yeah, some were found not guilty. So, but it's a good question, because actually, I'm glad you asked the question, because from what they think is real, they hatched a plot that could have had catastrophic real-world consequences. And they were intending to do it. They were intending to do it. Now, I want to say, I don't know what their psychology is. Irrelevant. They're part of a subculture that believes what they're saying and acts according to it. It starts out with the pandemic. It starts out with pandemic denial. It starts out with anger against a dominant culture of science, reason, and public health, and a determination to do something against that culture, in this case, kill, capture, whatever, kidnap the governor. So it does fit the kind of situation that I'm talking about. How widespread was it? Well, okay, that's one. But they are part of that subculture, which is saying, pandemic is not an issue. We're being imposed. We have this dictatorial imposition on us. Now, once you go in that direction, it begins to get off the rails. That's the problem.
Harriet, did you?
That's a good question.
One last question? Okay, go ahead.
My question is, how do you explain the denialism of people who don't believe the big lie, that get their shots, they believe in climate change, but they refuse to see the gravity of the situation, and they close their eyes and vote for Trump?
Yeah. Okay, how do you explain, what you want to?
No, go ahead.
Oh, how do you explain the denial of people who do all the things we would consider appropriate from a public health perspective, and yet they have voted for Trump in any case? Now, we're all affected with a little bit of, to function in the daily way, right? You may need to not look everything fully in the face. You might be terrified. Remember how terrified people were at the beginning of Trump. Remember the Women's March and the demonstrations, and there was a lot of panic, and people were trying to explain it. People, while continuing to oppose Trump, many of them, learned how to live with it at the same time, very unhappily. It's not quite the same, but you're talking about, what about people who vote for Trump? And there are, I have a good example, a medical practitioner who I have seen accepts most of the criticisms that you're talking about, but voted for Trump transactionally. Very wealthy. He knew he was getting something, and he was willing to exchange his vote for Trump despite his criticism, because there were rewards for him. A lot of traditional Republicans, think about this, who continued to vote for Trump were very much that way. We didn't get a huge shift away from Trump among traditional Republicans. I think that's part of the reason why.
I think the bigger part of my question is the biggest denial on the part of these kind of people is the danger to our democracy.
Yeah, sure.
That they refuse to accept.
Yeah.
And they just call it fear-mongering.
Yeah. Right. I didn't hammer it hard enough just now. But the fact is that Republicans have made a very basic decision. And it's the Trump analysis of where the United States is where it's headed demographically. And where it's headed demographically is in a way that the Republicans would have to have an autopsy after the election and decide they need to move in a different direction. They did that after Romney. They didn't carry it out. But the autopsy would say, how do we become a majority political party again? And you have to appeal to younger people. You have to appeal with concrete things for working people. They didn't do that. instead, they doubled down on their appeal to the white patriarchy. They doubled down on that appeal, and they are deciding to exclude as many people from the election process as possible. We will be, they are saying to all of us, we will be a minority party thanks to certain fundamental features of American democracy. The Senate, the Electoral College, and gerrymandering, and thanks to the Supreme Court, which authorizes all of it. Thanks to all of this, we don't have to change who we are to appeal to, more minorities and younger people. All we have to do is shrink our base into our core group and continue to hold power. And that's what they're doing. Now, we have to face that that's the process going on today.
That's good. That's right out of the Academy Awards. Thank you, Joseph. And thank you so much, Ron, for those, I was going to say inspiring words, but the depressing, horrifying analysis and x-ray of what's going on in our country right now. If those of you who follow Freedom House, not Freedom House Detroit, Freedom House, the international organization, may know that the United States is no longer classified as a full democracy. We are a partial democracy, so wrap your heads around that one too. We are going to conclude with this beautiful song as we go on our way. Thank you to Ron. Thank you to David Weeks, who does our streaming every week, to Arthur, who runs the service, and to my friend Joseph. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.